The first thing my uncle said after the reading was, "Well, Clara, I guess blood isn't always thicker than paper." He was leaning against the doorframe of my grandmother's study, arms crossed, wearing a smile I had never seen on his face before. It was the kind of smile people wear when they believe they've gotten away with something. Behind him, his wife Diane was already measuring the windows with her eyes, probably imagining new curtains. And there I was, still wearing the black dress I'd driven 4 hours in from Boston, standing in the middle of a house that had been my whole world since I was 7 years old, being told I no longer had a place in it. My uncle straightened up and said it plainly. "You should probably find a hotel tonight. Diane and I need the space." That was Tuesday. My grandmother had been in the ground for less than 36 hours. I should start from the beginning, because none of this makes sense without understanding who Eleanor Brennan was. My grandmother served 28 years on the federal bench in Vermont. She was appointed during the Reagan era and stayed through 4 administrations, retiring only when her hands became too stiff to write opinions longhand, which she insisted on doing even after her clerks begged her to use a computer. She was not famous in the way television judges are famous. No one stopped her on the street. But in legal circles across New England, her name carried weight. Lawyers who had argued before her spoke about it the way climbers talk about a difficult summit. She was precise, patient, and absolutely unwilling to tolerate laziness in reasoning. At home, she was warmer than people expected. She made cinnamon rolls on Sunday mornings from a recipe she refused to write down because she said good cooking, like good judgment, should live in the hands, not on paper. She let me stay up past bedtime reading on the window seat in the library. She taught me how to build a fire, how to drive a stick shift on the back roads outside Woodbury, how to look someone in the eye when delivering bad news because they deserved at least that much respect. I came to live with her when I was 7. My mother, her younger daughter, had struggled with addiction most of my childhood. There were stretches of stability, sometimes months, once almost 2 years. But they always ended the same way. A missed school pickup, an empty refrigerator, a phone call from a neighbor. Eventually, my grandmother drove down to Hartford, packed my things into her Volvo, and brought me north. She never said a harsh word about my mother in front of me. She simply said, "You're going to stay with me for a while, and we're going to make sure you have what you need." That while turned into the rest of my childhood. My Uncle Richard was my grandmother's only son, 5 years older than my mother. He had gone into commercial real estate in the 90s and done reasonably well for a time, though his definition of well always seemed to require borrowing against the next deal. He drove expensive cars, belonged to a country club in Burlington, and talked about money the way some people talk about the weather, constantly and without much depth. His wife, Diane, came from a family that had once been wealthy and never stopped acting like it. Together, they moved through life, expecting comfort as a baseline condition. My grandmother loved Richard, I know she did. But I also caught her expression sometimes when he spoke about his latest venture or dropped a number into casual conversation. It was the same look she gave attorneys who wandered off point in her courtroom. Tolerant, but measuring. I went to law school because of her, not because she pressured me. She never once suggested I follow her path. But growing up in that house, surrounded by shelves of case law and the quiet discipline of a woman who believed the law was civilization's best attempt at fairness, something took hold in me. I graduated from Boston University, passed the bar, and took a job as a public defender. The pay was modest. The hours were brutal. But every time I stood up in court for someone who couldn't afford their own voice, I felt my grandmother's influence underneath me like bedrock. She was proud of that. I know because she told me, once, in her direct way. Most people choose careers. You chose a calling. Don't confuse the two, and you'll be fine. When her health declined that last winter, I drove up to Vermont every weekend. The estate sat on 40 acres outside Woodbury, a stone farmhouse built in 1891 with wide porches, a red barn that hadn't held animals in decades, and a view of the green mountains that made your chest ache if you looked at it long enough. Inside, the house smelled like wood smoke and old books, and the lavender sachets my grandmother kept in every closet. Even in hospice care, she insisted on being moved to the library each afternoon, the room she called her cathedral. Legal volumes lined 3 walls floor to ceiling. Her writing desk sat beneath a tall window overlooking the meadow. 2 days before she died, she asked me to sit with her there. "Clara?" she said. Her voice had gone thin, but her eyes were the same. Sharp, steady, missing nothing. "I'm here." She studied me for a long moment. People become most honest when they believe no one important is watching. I smiled a little. "That sounds like a ruling." "It is." She placed her hand over mine. Her fingers were cold. "When the time comes, read the whole document. Every page, especially when everyone around you is in a hurry." I thought she was speaking generally. Grandmother loved aphorisms. She collected them the way other women collected jewelry. I squeezed her hand and promised I would. She died on a Thursday morning with snow falling outside the library window. The funeral was held at the Congregational Church in Woodbury. It was standing room only. Retired judges drove up from Montpelier. A senator sent flowers. 3 of her former clerks, now partners at major firms, sat together in the second row and wept without embarrassment. My Uncle Richard and Diane arrived in a black Mercedes. Richard wore a dark suit and an expression of public sorrow that looked rehearsed. Diane kept checking her phone during the eulogy. People found me afterward and said the same kind things. "Your grandmother talked about you all the time. She said you were the most principled person she'd ever trained. She was proud of you, Clara, deeply proud." I was grateful, but exhausted. Grief doesn't just sit in your chest. It soaks into everything, makes simple tasks feel like wading through deep water. The will reading happened 3 days later at the offices of Hadley and Marsh in downtown Montpelier. The firm had handled my grandmother's affairs for decades. Samuel Hadley himself, 74 years old with white hair and a bow tie he'd probably been wearing since the Carter administration, conducted the reading. He offered tea. Nobody touched it. My uncle sat forward in his chair the way he did when he sensed a deal closing. Mr. Hadley opened the file and began. Richard received the estate. The house, the 40 acres, the investment accounts, and a collection of first-edition legal texts valued at nearly $500,000. In total, the property and assets were worth roughly $11 million. I watched my uncle's posture change. He didn't smile, but something relaxed behind his eyes, like a man who had just confirmed a reservation he'd been anxious about. When Mr. Hadley reached my name, there was a pause, then a brief provision. Personal effects. Her writing desk, a set of fountain pens, a leather journal she had kept during her years on the bench. That was all. Diane exhaled softly. Richard glanced at me with something that might have been sympathy but looked more like relief. I didn't feel anger. Not yet. I felt confusion, because I knew my grandmother. I knew her the way you know weather patterns when you've lived in the same valley your whole life. She was deliberate in everything. She would not have left me exposed without reason. But grief makes you doubt your own instincts. So I said nothing. We drove back to the estate in separate cars. By the time I arrived, Richard was already inside, standing in the living room with his hands on his hips like a contractor surveying a new project. "We need to discuss logistics," he said when I walked in. "Logistics?" "Living arrangements." He clasped his hands behind his back, a gesture I recognized. He was imitating our grandmother without realizing it. "Diane and I will be moving in by the weekend. We'll need the guest rooms cleared." I stared at him. "I've lived here since I was 7, and I appreciate that. Mom was generous. But the house is mine now, and Diane and I need privacy to plan the renovations." "Renovations?" Diane appeared from the kitchen, already holding a glass of wine she'd found somewhere. "The kitchen is completely outdated, and that library needs to become a proper entertaining space." She gestured vaguely toward the room where my grandmother had spent her final days. "All those old books make it feel like a museum." Something cold moved through my stomach. "You're converting the library?" "Modernizing," Diane corrected. My uncle walked to the front door and held it open. The evening air was sharp with cold. "February in Vermont doesn't negotiate." "I'll give you until tomorrow morning," he said. "That should be enough time to pack your things." I looked at him for a long time. I thought about all the Thanksgivings my grandmother had hosted in this house, the way she always set an extra place at the table in case someone showed up alone. I thought about the summers I spent reading on the porch while fireflies drifted across the meadow. I thought about her hand on mine in the library, her voice thin but certain. "You're asking me to leave tonight? I'm telling you," he said. Not unkindly, but firmly, the way you'd speak to someone whose appointment had ended. I packed in the room I'd slept in since childhood. The wall still had the bookshelves my grandmother had installed when I was 12 because I'd run out of space for novels. I folded clothes into a suitcase. I took the leather journal and the fountain pens Mr. Hadley had mentioned. In the desk drawer, I found something I hadn't seen in years. A small brass compass my grandmother had given me the day I left for law school. The engraving on the back read, "True north doesn't move." I held it for a moment, then put it in my coat pocket. When I came downstairs, my uncle was in the kitchen pouring himself a scotch from a bottle that had belonged to my grandmother. Diane was on the phone with someone, laughing about square footage. "All set?" Richard asked. "Yes." He walked me to the door. On the front porch, he paused. "No hard feelings, Clara. You're young. You've got a career. You'll land on your feet." Then he closed the door. I sat in my car for a long time. The house glowed warmly behind me, every window lit. The mountains were invisible in the darkness, but I could feel them there, solid and indifferent to human drama. I turned the key and drove south toward the interstate. I spent the night at a comfort inn outside White River Junction. The room smelled like industrial cleaner and carpet shampoo. I lay on the bed fully clothed, staring at the ceiling, replaying my grandmother's words. Read the whole document. Every page. At the time, I had assumed she was speaking philosophically. Now, alone in a motel room with my suitcase on the floor, I wasn't sure anymore. 2 days later, my phone rang at 7 a.m. I was sitting in a coffee shop near Beacon Hill, staring at a brief I couldn't focus on. The screen showed Hadley and Marsh, Montpelier, VT. "Miss Brennan," said Samuel Hadley. His voice was calm, but there was something underneath it. A texture I couldn't quite place. "I hope I'm not calling too early." "No, sir." "Good. I have a question for you, and I'd appreciate an honest answer." I waited. "Did your uncle read the entire will?" The question stopped me cold. I assumed he did. There was a pause, then a sound that might have been a chuckle. That's what I was afraid of. "Mr. Hadley, what are you telling me?" "I'm telling you," he said slowly, "that the document I read at the office last week was only the first section of your grandmother's estate plan." I set my coffee down. "There's more?" "Quite a bit more." A memory surfaced. My grandmother in the library, her hand over mine. "When the time comes, read the whole document. Every page. What does the rest say?" "I think it would be best if you came to the office. Your grandmother left specific instructions about timing. She asked me to wait 72 hours after the initial reading before making contact, and only if certain conditions presented themselves." "What conditions?" "Behavioral ones." The word sat between us like a stone dropped into still water. "I can be there by noon," I said. "I'll have coffee waiting." The drive north felt different this time. I'd made this trip hundreds of times, but the highway looked sharper, the bare trees more deliberate against the gray sky, as though the landscape itself was paying attention. I kept turning Mr. Hadley's words over in my mind. Behavioral conditions. My grandmother had spent nearly 3 decades evaluating human behavior from the bench. She understood motive, rationalization, and self-deception better than most psychologists. If she had built conditions into her will, they wouldn't be arbitrary. Mr. Hadley's office was warm and quiet. He stood when I entered, offered his hand, and gestured to the chair across from his desk. Between us sat a thick folder I hadn't seen before. "Before we begin," he said, "I want you to know that your grandmother and I discussed this arrangement extensively over the last 2 years of her life. Every provision was deliberate." He opened the folder and turned to a section marked Conditional Inheritance Clause. "Your uncle inherited the estate," he said, "but not unconditionally." My pulse quickened. "The will specifies 3 requirements." He adjusted his glasses. "First, your uncle must allow you permanent residence at the family property for as long as you choose." I stared at him. "Second, the estate library must be preserved in its current state as a working legal archive, accessible to law students and clerks in the region. My grandmother's cathedral. Third, your uncle must continue funding the Eleanor Brennan Rural Legal Aid Program." He looked up at me. "Your grandmother established that program 8 years ago. It provides free legal representation to low-income families across 3 counties. She funded it personally from the estate's investment income. I knew about the program. I'd volunteered for it during law school summers. I hadn't known my grandmother was the sole funder." "And the enforcement clause?" I asked quietly. Mr. Hadley smiled faintly. If any of these conditions are violated, ownership of the entire estate, the property, the accounts, the collection, transfers immediately and irrevocably to you. The room went very still. He kicked me out within 24 hours, I said. Yes, he's planning to gut the library. So, I've heard. And the legal aid program? Mr. Hadley reached into the folder and produced a printed email. Your uncle's wife contacted our office yesterday requesting that all charitable disbursements be frozen pending review. He set the paper down. That would be condition 3. I leaned back in my chair. My hands were trembling slightly, not from anger, but from the sheer weight of what my grandmother had engineered. She knew, I whispered. She did. How? Mr. Hadley folded his hands. Clara, I worked with your grandmother for 23 years. She was the most perceptive person I have ever known. She told me once that the surest way to understand someone's character is to give them something valuable and then watch what they protect and what they discard. He pushed another document toward me. A transfer certification, already prepared, notarized, waiting for signatures. She had you prepare this in advance. She instructed me to have it ready. She said, and I quote, Samuel, I hope I'm wrong about my son, but prepare the paperwork in case I'm right. I pressed my fingers against my eyes. The grief that I'd been carrying all week shifted into something different, not lighter, but clearer. Like fog burning off a valley. There's one more thing. Mr. Hadley opened the folder again and removed a sealed envelope. My name was written across the front in her careful, precise handwriting. The same handwriting I'd seen on birthday cards, grocery lists, and appellate opinions. She asked that you read it privately. I took the envelope and opened it. Clara, if you're reading this, then my son has confirmed what I spent years hoping he would outgrow. Do not hold it against him too harshly. Weakness is not the same as malice, though the results can look identical. I built this arrangement not as punishment, but as a mirror. People deserve to see their choices clearly. Your uncle has spent most of his life believing that inheritance is something owed rather than something earned. I wanted him to have the chance to prove me wrong. If he couldn't, then the estate belongs in the hands of someone who understands what it represents. Now comes the harder part. You will be tempted to return the hurt you received. That temptation will feel like justice, but it isn't. Justice requires proportion. Cruelty requires only opportunity. I am not asking you to be soft. I am asking you to be precise. There is a difference between mercy and weakness, just as there is a difference between strength and vengeance. A good judge knows where one ends and the other begins. The legal aid program is my legacy. The house is just a building. The land is just dirt. But the work we do for people who cannot fight for themselves, that is the only inheritance worth protecting. Take care of what matters. Let go of what doesn't. And if your uncle ever finds the courage to apologize honestly, leave enough room for him to try. True north doesn't move. Grandmother. I sat with the letter for a long time. The office was quiet. Late afternoon light came through the window and fell across the desk in pale gold rectangles. I could hear the faint sound of traffic on Main Street and, somewhere distant, a church bell marking the hour. Mr. Hadley waited without speaking. He was the kind of man who understood that some silences need to be left alone. Finally, I looked up. When can the transfer be finalized? I can file by end of week. And my uncle? He'll be notified formally once the paperwork is recorded with the county. I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. Mr. Hadley. Yes? I'd like to go home. He smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. I drove back to Woodbury the following Monday. It was one of those late February mornings when the sky over Vermont turns the color of brushed steel and the snow on the mountains catches just enough light to glow. The road wound through small towns that hadn't changed much in 50 years, past white churches and general stores and farmhouses with smoke curling from their chimneys. When I turned onto the long dirt driveway, the house appeared through the trees the way it always had. Stone walls and dark green shutters and the wide porch where my grandmother used to sit with her evening tea. Richard's Mercedes was parked near the barn. Next to it, improbably, was a contractor's truck. I parked and stepped out. The air smelled like snow and pine and wood smoke. For a moment, I simply stood and looked at the house. Then I walked up the steps and knocked. Diane opened the door. She was wearing a cashmere sweater and an expression that collapsed the instant she saw me. What are you doing here? I live here, I said. Behind her, I could hear voices. Richard appeared in the hallway, a set of architectural plans rolled under his arm. When he saw me, his face went tight. Clara, this really isn't a good time. Actually, I said, stepping inside, it's exactly the right time. I opened the leather folder and removed the transfer document. Richard took it reflexively, the way you'd catch something thrown at you. He unrolled it, read the first paragraph, then read it again. The color left his face in stages, like a tide going out. This can't be real. It's filed with the county. Diane snatched the paper. Her eyes moved quickly across the text. I watched the moment it landed. Her mouth opened, then closed. She looked at me as if I had performed a magic trick she couldn't explain. There's a second section to the will, I said. Grandmother included conditions. You violated all 3 within the first week. Richard's voice came out strained. What conditions? You expelled me from the property. You're dismantling the library. And your wife requested that the legal aid funding be frozen. Silence. The contractor, who had been standing awkwardly in the hallway holding a tape measure, quietly let himself out the back door. Richard set the document down on the hall table. His hands were shaking. She set me up. No, I said. She gave you a chance. You made your own choices. He looked around the house. The stone walls, the wide plank floors, the staircase he had climbed as a boy. Something in his expression shifted from disbelief to something rawer. Not anger, something closer to recognition. Diane started to speak, but Richard held up his hand. They looked at each other. Then he looked at me. So what happens now? The same question. The same words people use when the ground shifts beneath them. A week ago, he had asked me to leave. Now the positions were reversed, and both of us could feel the weight of that symmetry. I could have repeated his words back to him. You should probably find a hotel tonight. Part of me wanted to. That part felt justified and righteous and completely certain. But my grandmother's voice was louder. Justice requires proportion. Cruelty requires only opportunity. Here's what's going to happen, I said. I pulled 3 documents from the folder and laid them on the table. The estate transfers to my name. That's final. They nodded slowly. The library stays exactly as it is. Every book, every shelf, every piece of furniture. It becomes a working legal archive, open to law students and clerks in the region, the way grandmother wanted. And the legal aid program? Expands. I pointed to the second document. Grandmother left detailed plans. The old barn is being converted into offices. We're adding 2 full-time attorneys and a paralegal. Free representation for families across Washington, Orange, and Caledonia counties who can't afford counsel. Richard studied the plans. That's ambitious. It's necessary. A long pause followed. Diane was looking at the floor. Richard was looking at the mountains through the window. And us? He finally asked. The cottage by the orchard is empty. It needs work, but it's livable. You can stay there if you want. He looked up sharply. You're not kicking us out? No. Why? I thought about my grandmother's letter. About proportion and precision. About the difference between strength and vengeance. Because that's not who I am, I said. And it's not who she raised me to be. Something broke in my uncle's face then. Not dramatically. There were no tears, no grand confession, just a small crack in the wall he had been hiding behind for most of his adult life. He nodded once, then turned and walked out of the room. Diane lingered. She opened her mouth as if to say something sharp, then stopped. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked uncertain. I'll start packing our things, she said quietly. After they left the room, I walked into the library. The late morning light was falling through the tall windows exactly the way it always had, catching the spines of the books, the brass lamp on the desk, the reading glasses my grandmother would never pick up again. The room smelled like leather and paper and the faintest trace of cinnamon from years of Sunday mornings. I sat down in her chair. Desk sat the wooden box I had always assumed contained old photographs. I opened it. Inside was a second letter, shorter than the first. Clara, if you're reading this in the library, then you've already decided. I knew you would choose correctly. You always had the clearest compass in this family. Now do the work. E.B. Months passed. Spring arrived in that slow Vermont way, snow retreating up the mountains, mud season turning every road into a negotiation. The barn conversion started in April. By June, the Eleanor Brennan Rural Legal Aid Clinic opened its doors with a staff of 4 and a waiting list that was already growing. The library became exactly what my grandmother had envisioned. Law students from UVM drove up on weekends to research in the archive. 2 of her former clerks, now professors, began hosting monthly seminars in the room where she had once read opinions aloud to me as bedtime stories. Richard and Diane moved into the orchard cottage. The first few weeks were tense and quiet, but something shifted the afternoon. A Korean War veteran named Harold showed up at the clinic, unable to understand his VA benefits paperwork. Richard, who happened to be on the porch, walked him inside and sat with him for 2 hours, helping him fill out forms. When Harold left, Richard stood in the doorway watching the old man's truck disappear down the driveway. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Diane began volunteering at the clinic's front desk 3 days a week. She was surprisingly good at it, organized, efficient, and unexpectedly kind to the families who came through nervous and overwhelmed. One evening in late September, Richard found me on the porch watching the sun drop behind the green mountains. The light was the color of honey, and the air carried that particular autumn sharpness that means summer has made its final argument and lost. He leaned on the railing beside me. "I've been thinking about Mom," he said. "I think about her every day." He was quiet for a while. "She was right about me. I didn't want to admit that. I know. I spent most of my life measuring everything in dollars," she tried to tell me. I didn't listen. I watched a hawk circle slowly over the meadow. "She left you one more chance," I said. "That's more than a lot of people get." He nodded slowly. Then he said something I didn't expect. "The clinic helped a woman last week. Single mother, landlord trying to evict her illegally. Your staff got it resolved in 3 days." He paused. "She cried in the parking lot afterward. Diane saw the whole thing." He looked at me. "That's the kind of thing Mom cared about, isn't it?" "Yes," I said. "That's exactly the kind of thing." We stood there together as the sky darkened and the first stars appeared over the mountains. The house glowed behind us, warm and full of purpose. Through the windows, I could see the clinic's evening volunteer meeting underway in what used to be the dining room. Laughter drifted out through the screen door. My grandmother used to say that a building is only as good as the lives it shelters. Standing there that evening, watching her house become what she had always intended it to be, I understood something clearly for the first time. The inheritance she left me was never the property. It was never the money or the collection or the 40 acres of Vermont hillside. It was the question she had planted inside the will like a seed, the question that mattered more than any asset. When you finally have the power to hurt the people who hurt you, what will you choose instead? I chose the work. And every morning when I sit at her desk in the library and open the first case file of the day, I can feel her answer settling quietly around me, steady as true north. And if this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of someone who taught you that character is built in the moments when no one is keeping score, then I hope you carry that person with you today, because the ones who teach us to choose wisely deserve to be remembered long after the paperwork is filed. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories about family, integrity, and the choices that shape who we become, you're always welcome here. Thank you for listening.